it's Kelvin, and welcome back once again to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. In today's video, I'm going to show you my workflow and technique for painting this cabin in the forest illustration. And the process here is pretty easy. I think it's definitely suitable for beginners. And I think the key thing that I'm going to focus on in this video is how I would handle a dense forest. It's actually surprisingly hard to paint that way, so hopefully this technique here is going to make that much easier for you. So I've already got the Forester watercolor paper texture loaded into Procreate, and for the brushes, I'm going to be doing all of this with the ones in the regular watercolor kit. And as usual, I'll put links to everything I use, including this free sketch and color palette, down in the description below. So I've got the sketch and the color palette placed up here as the very top layer. I just want to make sure that I change the transparency mode to multiply. Then I can start painting on a layer underneath the paper texture, just like you normally would. And I'm going to start with this kind of dark green color. And I'll use the abstract round brush, which is again part of the regular watercolor kit. And at the largest size, I'll just kind of quickly and loosely fill out the wash here. Now I've gone over it twice to make it a little bit darker, but I need to use the water blender to smooth all this out. Now after that, I'm going to grab the eraser brush, and this is set to the fine liner pen, which is also part of the regular watercolor kit. And I'm just going to go around this, maybe around 10%, and I'm basically just going to cut out the silhouette here, just following the lines on the sketch. And if I zoom in here, it's going to be very hard to see on the camera, but I can just barely see the sketch outline of the house. So I'm also going to follow that with the eraser as well. Next, I need to remove everything that isn't this background here, so I'm going to do that with the selection tool, set to automatic, and I'll just click and drag here on the background until the whole thing is selected and filled in with this kind of pink color. I think maybe around 40% here with the threshold is good. Then I'm going to go down here to invert, and that's going to flip around my selection. So I selected the background. Now everything that's not the background is selected, and we can easily clear it by now just tapping on that layer and clicking clear. And this is again just a time-saving technique. It does take quite a long time to go in there just manually with the eraser. Next, I'm going to go through and color each of these individual trees. And all the trees that are shaped like triangles, those are the pine trees, and I'm going to do those last. For now, I'm just going to color all these regular trees, and I'm going to use these kind of fall colors. So first, I'm going to make sure I've got this layer selected here, the one with the green background wash. And I'll zoom in here to see this a little bit better. Now first, you need to select the color that you want to color the tree. So I'll do a long press, I think on this orange tone, and grab that color. And you can just double check that it's there in the corner. Next, I'll grab the selection tool, set it to freehand. And I'm just going to draw and kind of isolate this tree, just following the lines on the sketch. There we go, I've got that tree isolated. Now I can just click and drag this color, and I'll drop it onto that tree. And you can see it just fills it in. Now that color is fine by itself, but if you don't quite like it and you want to adjust it a little bit, you can always go to the adjustments, hue, saturation, and brightness, and you could shift it a little bit, mess with the saturation, and just set it wherever you think it looks good. And just to continue this example, I'll do it again for this tree, and then I'll fast forward it and do the rest of them. So again, I need to choose a color for this tree, so I think I'll use that orange color. Again, the selection tool set to freehand, and I'll just isolate the tree following the lines in the sketch. Circle back, then I can just drag this color and drop it onto the green, and it just fills it out. So all the regular trees are colored in, and now I'm going to go through and do the pine trees, but instead of those fall colors, I'm going to use different variations of these kind of olivey green tones. And after all the trees are colored in, I can move on and do the road. And I'll do it the same way. I'm just going to use the freehand selection tool and just kind of isolate it on the sketch. Then I'll select whatever color looks good for the road, and I'll just drop it in. Now the next step is optional. It is a little bit more work, but this is a great point to add a little bit of shading. So I'll turn off the sketch just kind of temporarily so I can see this a little bit better. And I'm going to look for areas that are struggling with contrast. And it generally looks pretty good, but definitely down here where we have the red and the green here, they're about the same level of brightness, so they blend in a little bit. So I'm going to kind of use the selection tool, and I'm going to brighten just one half of this tree, this pine tree. So I'll select it, then reconnect it, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten it. Then after that, I can grab the water blender brush and just set it a big enough size that I can fit it in there, and I'll kind of blend that boundary. And not only does it make the tree kind of stand off a little bit more, it also makes it more interesting because it has a kind of ombre fade in it. And I'm going to go through this and just do a little bit of shading, a little bit of highlighting, and blending just where I think it needs help with the contrast. Next, I'm going to move on and add all the branch details, and this is really easy to do. I'm going to do it on its own layer, so I'll make a new layer that's above the background here. For the brush, I'm going to use the fine liner pen brush, maybe around 20 or 30%, and basically just on all of these trees. I'll do the trees first, and I'll do the pine trees last. I'm just going to use any color that stands off, and I'll rough out some very, very, very simple branches like this. And in cases where it overlaps on the pine tree, it's totally okay because we're on our own layer, and I can just use the eraser brush and just sort of cut it back so it conforms a little bit better. And I'm going to go through and do all these kind of branches on the normal trees in various shades of white and brown and gray. And after all the normal trees are done, I can do the pine trees. So I'll select a kind of greenish tone here that stands off, and I'm going to use the same fine liner pen, and I'll just test it out here. Looks like maybe I could make it a little bit lighter. I want there to be enough contrast that it stands off, but it's not kind of too eye-catching. So there we go, that looks a lot better. And I'm just going to go down each of these pine trees, just on one side, just like this, and then I'll go down the other side, just like this. And I'm going to go through each pine tree, and I'll shift this shade of green a little bit so each one is a little bit different. And doing the pine trees this way is a little bit hard to control, and it does go beyond the edge a little bit. I think I generally like to leave it. It does add a nice kind of look to this, but along the bottom where they're kind of extending out, I think it is a good idea to erase those and kind of cut them back. And to finish the pine trees, I'm going to do a similar technique, but I'll use a brownish color. Same brush, fine liner pen, same size, and I'll just do a really simple line, kind of symbolizing a trunk. Now that the background scene is all done, we can move on and finish up the house. So I like to turn off the background details. It just makes it easier to focus on the house. And I'll turn the sketch back on, and I'll make a new layer for the house that's above everything. And first, I'm going to lay down some background colors. So these colors over here are the main ones for the house, and I'm going to use the abstract round brush. And first, I'll fill in the house with this kind of beige color. And after that, I'll use the water blender and then the eraser to kind of cut it out, just like I did with the green background we did earlier. And to remove all the excess watercolor around the edges, I'll use the same trick. I'll use the automatic selection tool, kind of click and drag, select the whole house. Then I can go to invert. I'll tap on that layer and click clear, and it will just delete all that extra stuff. So the house has three main colors, and those are because of the different materials. So we've got this down here is going to be brick. This is going to be a kind of gray siding. The roof will be red, and again, this one is brick. So this sort of dark beige color just by itself I think is good enough for the bricks. I just need to isolate and change this to a gray color. So I'm going to grab the selection tool again, make sure it's set to freehand, and I'll just kind of draw around this and sort of isolate it. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just desaturate it and brighten it a little bit. And for the roof, I'll do a kind of similar thing. I just want to make sure I don't select the chimney because I want that to stay brick. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll darken it, saturate it, and try to shift the color here to find a nice red color. And now to add all the details on the house, all the windows and kind of lines and stuff, I'm going to do that on another layer. So I'll make a new layer above the house, and I'm going to keep this pretty brief. I think first I'll start with the brick because there's a little bit of a trick to getting a nice brick texture there. So all the details are going to be done with the fine liner pen brush. And the main trick here with the brick is I'm going to do a bunch of kind of dashes. So I just grab that color and then I'll test it out. It doesn't stand off, so I'm going to shift it so it's a little bit lighter. And I just want to find a very, very subtle shade that barely stands off this brick color. And once I find it, I'm going to do a bunch of dashes like this. And after that, I'll change it again to a kind of darker version of that. And again, I'll check it so it stands off, but it's still pretty subtle. And I'll do a bunch more dashes, and I'll start to kind of interlock them a little bit. And then to finish it up, I'll select the lightest version here, and I'll do a couple of very, very kind of bright colored bricks. And there we go, that's my trick to doing the bricks. And now I'll just move on and add a bunch of line details just to make all these details pop out. Next, after all the details on the house are finished, you can see here in the layers panel that we've done all this on 2 layers. So here's the background wash, and then on the layer above, here are all the details. I recommend merging those together onto one layer. So this house is kind of 3-dimensional, so it makes sense that the front and the side would be slightly different shades. So I recommend brightening the front. So I'm going to grab the selection tool, set it to freehand, and I'll just isolate the front of the house. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten it. And it's a small touch, but I also think it's a good idea to add a little bit of a shadow under the eaves here. So again, I'll grab the selection tool, still set to freehand, and I'll isolate that shadow. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll darken that. And I think I'll do a similar shadow over here as well. And there we go, the house is all done. And I'll turn off the sketch. I don't need it anymore, and I'll just go ahead and turn everything else back on. Now, in a lot of cases, the house isn't exactly lining up with the hole you cut in the background. So what you can do is actually use the warp to sort of adjust the house. Now, personally, I like a little bit of a white line going around the edges. I just think it adds a nice look. But in some cases, especially up here, it's just too strong. So I'm gonna make sure I've got the house layer selected. I'll go to my arrow tool, and I'm gonna select warp. And I'm just going to carefully bend and adjust the house so there's a very, very subtle white line, but it's not too bold. And there we go, this one is all done, and here's what it looks like when I print it out. So hopefully this process is pretty easy to follow. This is definitely aimed at beginners, but I also think some of you more advanced painters will like to see a really quick way to produce a background like this. And it works well when your focal point isn't the forest itself. So in this case, it's about the cabin, so we can get away with keeping the background and all the trees really simple. And if you like videos like this, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And that pretty much wraps it up. As always, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.